You need something meaningful to set against suffering. That's what you have to set against suffering, not happiness. Sometimes you don't have, that's not an option sometimes. Happiness is like, I don't think I had any happiness at all for 3 years, pretty much.
And what is...
It was dire. Well, my wife, she spent a year hovering on the brink of death in a variety of different ways. Before that, my daughter had catastrophic health problems, which have mostly resolved. And then I got extremely ill. So we've been in, and at the same time, we were facing social pressure of like an unparalleled magnitude, people trying to, bring this enterprise to a halt, I suppose. That's probably the right way to think about it. Most of that time, I was hoping that I would die. I've been grateful for the good things that have happened to me, but I don't think I was grateful enough before just for mundane normality,
Yeah.
And, you think you don't have everything you could have, and perhaps that's true, but if you can sit down and breathe, there's lots of people who don't have that. Life is brutally difficult and sometimes unbearably brutally difficult. And you can see the progressives playing with that notion. It's warped into this sense of victimization, but it does reflect some understanding of the underlying tragic reality of life. And so it's good to get that right out on the table to begin with. Say, well, you're miserable. You have your reasons. And they might be deep reasons. But if you let the misery demoralize you and make you bitter and cynical and cowardly and make you withdraw, then first of all, that's a failure in the highest sense on your part. And all it's going to do is make everything worse. And then you might think, well, what do you have to respond to that? How do you respond to that catastrophe and challenge? And the answer is, terrible as things are, there's a lot more to you than you can possibly imagine. And that if you face those things forthrightly and with some faith and courage, then you can have the adventure of your life and prevail even over catastrophe. People have difficult lives, and that life itself is full of suffering, and that we make it worse with our own voluntary stupidity and willful blindness and even malevolence. And that's what we contend with. We contend with suffering and malevolence. And as a consequence, it's necessary to pursue something that has substantive meaning to set against that. And I think that it's self-evident, once it's articulated anyways, that most people find deep meaning in their life as a consequence, not of their rights or their impulsive pleasures even, but as a consequence of bearing responsibility for themselves, for their family, for their community. And the heavier the responsibility, the better.
Well, Professor Stephen Hawking, before he died, gave me his last television interview, and he said that the biggest threat to the future of mankind was when artificial intelligence learned to self-design. What do you think the biggest threat to mankind is?
Narcissistic compassion. Now, AIs, it's a threat too, but if we had our act together ethically, it's possible that AI could become a useful servant rather than a tyrannical master. You don't want to automate your tyrannical masters. The ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. I can give you just one example. It's like I know a fair number of extremely wealthy people, and I tell you, man, they have a burden of responsibility that would crush me, would crush the typical person. They're just working flat out, like 90 hours a week. They have their money and they have their status, and that's not nothing. But don't be thinking that there isn't a price to be paid for that. They don't see their families. They're often divorced. They don't see their children grow up, and they don't have time off. Now, there are wealthy, what would you call, playboy types, I suppose, who live out the dreams of wealth of a foolish 14-year-old, but they're not that common. And you have to be careful of what you're jealous of, because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing to understand, you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them, because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win, because you could be a little better today than you were yesterday.
Most of the time, when you're discussing something that needs to be discussed, everybody's actually rather upset about it. You know, if you're actually talking about something important, right? Because why talk otherwise, unless you're just shooting the breeze? But if there's an issue at hand that has to be discussed, then people are already upset and they have different viewpoints. And the offensiveness in some sense is built into that. And you know that because if you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have an intimate relationship, and you're discussing something that's difficult, the probability that you're not going to offend each other if you're actually having the conversation is zero. And so you don't have to think unless you have a problem. And if you have a problem, then when you think, you're going to offend people. And so what, are we not going to think? That seems like a bad idea.
Liberals are higher in openness, that's trait creativity, and lower in conscientiousness, especially orderliness. And that seems to be because they believe, or their niche is an informational niche. They believe that the free flow of information is worth the risk. So that'd be the free flow of people across borders, the free flow of ideas across borders, the free flow of concepts across categories. They'd rather that the borders were permeable. Now, the conservatives are low in openness and high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they take the opposite tack. They think, well, yeah, there's danger in too much openness. There's danger in borders that are too permeable. Things can change too fast. Entire societies can become destabilized, and everyone can end up not knowing which way is up. And the thing is that both of those attitudes are correct. It depends on the time. You know, sometimes things are changing so fast that everybody's knocked off their feet and things are falling apart. And sometimes things are so rigid that there isn't any new water flowing and everything's ground to a halt. You need liberals because now and then the right thing to do is to come up with something new. And you need conservatives because now and then the right thing to do is to do what everybody has always done. And the reason you need political dialogue is so that the liberals and the conservatives can continue to argue about which of those solutions is appropriate right now.
The game of dividing human beings up by their group identity ends in disaster, no matter who plays it and no matter what the reasons are. Adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
The next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, so, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement. The micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day. You're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. You don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail, because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss. And both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. But my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring, and it's such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. And I think we did an economic calculation about that a while back, right? Your time's probably worth $50 an hour, something like that. I mean, you're not getting paid that now, but you're young. And so this is investment time. And what you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So let's say it's $50 an hour, which is perfectly reasonable. So if you waste 6 hours a day, and you are, then you're wasting about $2,000 a week, or about $100,000 a year. So go ahead, but that's what it's costing you every hour. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. So let's say it's not $50, it's 30, whatever. Maybe it's 100. It's somewhere in that range. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. And so that seems like a stupid solution. So, okay, so anyways, as far as I can tell, that's how you can improve your conscientiousness. Outline a goal that you actually would like to hit. And even better, here's something else you can think about when you're negotiating in your life. You could say, if you're kind of pessimistic, you'd say, well, we have to negotiate an agreement. I'd like to walk away not miserable and resentful. Okay, let's call that a baseline. And that's how you're going to negotiate with your wife or your husband. That's a good thing to know. You want to negotiate so that you don't walk away miserable and resentful, because that makes you hostile and then you'll work to hurt them. And I would say that's unless you want to hurt them, and then of course they'll happily return the favor. If you want to exist in a place where you're basically hitting each other in the head repeatedly for 30 years, you go right ahead. But I wouldn't say that that's a particularly good way of living. So you might say, well, the minimal precondition for a successful negotiation is that you don't walk away resentful and angry. And so that's also how you know when you have something to say to someone. Because the rule has to be, if you're going to walk away resentful and angry, you've got something to say. Doesn't mean you're right, by the way. But it does mean that you have something to say. But it's kind of a low bar, Like if I wanted to live with you for 30 years, maybe we should say, how about we walk away from our mutual negotiations thrilled? Well, why not? You got to aim for something. You could aim for that. You want to negotiate with your boss for a new salary. You might think, okay, I've got this damn job. How much would I have to be paid so I'd be so bloody excited to go to work I could hardly stand it? Well, you could at least know what that number is. And then you could go there and say, well, look, you like to have me around. I've been doing some thinking. I think if you paid me this amount of money, I'd be so thrilled to go to work that you could hardly even keep me away from here. And your boss might think, wow, I'd actually really like to have someone around who'd be so thrilled to work that I can't get rid of them. It's like, I can't give you all of that. I'll give you 75%. Maybe we can renegotiate it in a year. It's like, hey, good deal. Or you can, be some weaselly coward and go in there and snivel about how awful your life is and walk away barely able to tolerate the outcome of the negotiation. It's like, I wouldn't recommend that. And it's funny because I've watched people do this repeatedly in my clinical practice, because we plan all the time, because the rule is you're going to come and see me. I'm going to try to help you figure out how to have the life that you want to have. And we're going to think about that strategically. So you're making $50,000 a year right now. Maybe you should be making $150,000 in 3 years. And they think, well, that couldn't happen. It's like, not with that attitude. That's the first thing. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. If you don't ask people for the damn money, if you don't look for a better job, but they're going to come along and just shovel a boat full of money at you. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. But why is that impossible? You look at you people in here. It's like, what the hell is wrong with you? Nothing. So you can probably have what you want if you could figure out what the hell it was, and then you diligently pursued it. So, and then maybe you wouldn't whine about being alive. That'd be good, because people who whine about being alive are dangerous to themselves and other people. So you might think, I can have what I want, but you better well figure out what it is. And you can't just wait for the, have what you want fairy to show up at your doorstep and grant it, because obviously that's not going to happen. So okay, conscientiousness. Well, we talked about how you could improve that. Social networking. That's another big deal. It's one of the advantages that older people have over younger people. And so, for example, now that I'm in my 50s, roughly speaking, I know a bunch of other people who are, relatively well positioned in the dominance hierarchy, and they know all sorts of people. And so when I go to one of them and say, can you do X, or do you know X? They say no, but I know someone who can. And that's a huge advantage. So another thing that you want to think about as you move through life, and this is that use your ability to network properly. And that doesn't mean schmooze, and it doesn't mean go out and impress people. That's all just complete bloody rubbish. It means you try to surround yourself with people who are competent in multiple different dimensions, and you maintain your relationships with them. And that's a trading relationship too, right? It involves reciprocity. But it's a huge advantage. A social network is a huge advantage, and that's something extroverted people can be really good at, because they have that sort of social ability. And that goes along with the ability to sell. So another place that you can pick up power, and power for the good, for the right things, is to consciously develop and maintain your social networks. And that also means, well, let's talk about friendships for a minute. Here's how you know if someone's your friend. A, you can tell them bad news, and they'll listen. They won't tell you why, you're stupid and why that bad thing happened to you and how something worse happened to them once and, derail the whole conversation. You can actually tell them bad news and they'll listen. So that's a good thing. And then this is a weirder thing. You can tell them good news and they'll help you celebrate. And that's a really good way of deciding who you should have around you. Because if you have someone around you, something good happens to you and you're kind of afraid to even admit it because, God, something good happened to you. It's like, you let that be known and it'll certainly be taken away. So, you come out and you sort of tell someone half-heartedly that something good happened to you and they give you a whack and then talk about, the great thing that happened to them 3 years ago. Or worse, the great thing that happened to someone that they knew 3 years ago. It's like, go away from that person. They're not helpful to you. And they're not helpful to themselves either. And so you want to surround yourself. You got to think about this. You got to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best part of you. You can hang around with weasels and losers that are trying to pull you down to justify the fact that they're spiraling downhill as well. And the upside of that is you don't have to have any responsibility and you can all whine about how wretched life is, so that's pretty attractive. But I would say it's also a bad medium to long-term plan. And so it's acceptable and desirable to try to surround yourself with people who are facilitating your development. And you might say, well, I've got people around, I know them well, they're not doing that well and they don't fit into that category. It's like, what's your point? What are you going to do with them exactly? If they'll listen and cooperate with you and move towards a better future, great. If they don't pay any attention and they keep doing the same damn things over and over and they're not going anywhere and it's painful, then maybe the proper thing to do is say, you just have your misery. I'll go off and have my life. And maybe you'll wake up at some point in the future and think that's a better way of being. Because just putting up with it is, they call that enabling, right? You put up with that sort of behavior, you're providing tacit consent for it and even tacit approval. It's like, it's a bad idea. You have, I would say, both the right and the responsibility to surround yourself with people who are good for the best part of you. And that's not the same as, I don't have to elaborate on that. You can figure out what that means. Skills, that's another thing you can do if you want to increase your probability of success. Every time you have an opportunity to take an opportunity that would provide you with a new skill, do it, right? Learn to program, learn to write, learn to read new things, learn to public speak, learn how to introduce yourself to people, learn how to social network, learn how to go talk to your boss in a manner, this is the right way to go talk to someone who's supervising you. I see this problem, and here's a solution. And so I'm coming to talk to you about the problem and the solution. It's like that person is going to want to talk to you a lot. It's like because the other people they're talking to are going to come and say, I've got a problem. Can you do something about it? It's like they don't want to do something about it. They already got 50 things to do, So if you're the person who constantly brings forth a problem, even if they're accurate problems, why are they going to want to have you around? You're just another problem. Don't be a problem for the people who want to give you money. That's a good rule of thumb, man. If someone wants to give you money, then help them do that. And if they want to give you status and success, then help them do that, right? And you do that in part by bringing them solutions. And partly you do that by developing your skills. And so if things aren't going very well for you, this is also a good way of evaluating an opportunity. Should you take an opportunity? Well, here's the rule. Take the opportunity if it will teach you something that you can use for other opportunities. Because then even if it fails, which you probably will, it doesn't matter because you've accrued something of value that you can bring forward to the next situation. So, there's this old Jungian idea that I told you about. In the Chartres Cathedral, for example, the cathedral is made in the form of a cross, and the cross signifies the center of the world, and the dome signifies the sky. And so right below the dome at the center of the world, and it's a cross because the cross is the place of suffering. So that's the center of the world, because that's what you are. You're the place of suffering, right? You're the place of conscious suffering. That's the center of the world. And so inscribed on the floor is a maze, and it's a big maze, and it's a mandala, and there's a kind of a flower-shaped resting place right in the center. And what you're doing is walking in the maze, and you walk all 4 quadrants and you get to the middle, which is where you want to be. You want to be in the middle. Well, how do you get there? You walk everywhere. And what does that mean? It means every bloody time you're offered an opportunity, take it and develop your skills. And that's better than wealth, by the way. In fact, it actually constitutes wealth, because wealth constitutes what you have when someone takes all your money away, right? That's real wealth. And so the way that you build up that sort of wealth is you turn yourself into someone who's competent in multiple directions. And you can be doing that all the time, right? Especially with the kind of technology that you people have access to. I mean, you can learn anything you want whenever you want. So what a good deal that is, man. And so there's easy fruit hanging that you could pick, and I would recommend that you do that. So here's an example. Let's say you're not doing too bad, so maybe you're in the middle of the normal distribution, then you lose your job. Okay, and let's say you're a conscientious person. And we could say, just for the sake of argument, that you lose your job because of mass layoffs in your company. So it has nothing to do with you. It's fundamentally, it's just like luck of the draw, basically. But then what happens to you? Well, if you're conscientious, you're gonna go after yourself pretty hard. So you're gonna, and especially if you're also high in neuroticism, it's gonna depress you to lose your job. And maybe you're in a situation where you just, for one reason or another, you don't have that many other opportunities. Now, maybe you should have looked for them, but maybe you're in a depressed strata of the economy, or you're geographically located somewhere that makes moving difficult, or so on and so forth, you know. So, but you lose your job, and then you start to get depressed because of that. Well, then as you start to get depressed, you know, it decreases the probability that you're going to look for a job, but it also maybe starts to put stress on your family, and it also starts to decrease the probability that you're going to engage in positive social interaction. So now not only are you unemployed and suffering from economic stress, but your marriage is starting to suffer, and you're starting to isolate yourself from your friends. And then, of course, as your marriage suffers and the stress builds up, then that's going to make you more depressed, and that's going to keep you even farther away from your friends, and that's going to decrease the likelihood that you're going to have enough positive emotion and enthusiasm to look for another job. And then, you know, maybe you want to add a bit of a drinking problem to that just for fun, and you can see that you can get a spiral going that's just taking you down, right? And it's all sorts of things, because lots of times people conceptualize, let's say, you know, you're an unemployed guy and you go to counseling and you get a diagnosis of depression. And the thing about a diagnosis of depression, it's sort of like the assumption is there's something gone wrong with your psychological structure. It's like if you're unemployed and you're depressed, it isn't obvious at all that the problem is in your head. You know what I mean? It isn't even obvious that it's a psychological problem. It's just a problem, and problems can take you out. And so, you know, if you're unemployed and you're under economic stress, and your marriage is starting to shake, and you're isolating yourself from your friends, and you're less likely to be motivated to go look for a job, you can sort of think about that as a depressive spiral, but you can also think of it as a conspiracy, in some sense, of external forces that are auguring you into the ground. And we don't tend to conceptualize psychological disorders that way, but we should, because lots of times when people are suffering from something that you could describe in psychological terminology, and depression is a very good example of that, it isn't obvious that there's something wrong with them psychologically. Often they just are in trouble. And there isn't a category in psychological diagnosis for client in serious trouble. But my experience has been almost without exception that the people that come to see me because something's gone wrong with their life, not because they have a psychological problem. Now you could say, well, their psychological inadequacies, such as they might be, are interfering with their ability to recover, or maybe even served as precursors to, you know, increase the probability of the catastrophe, but it's still not exactly the appropriate way to conceptualize it. And, you know, because there's you inside you, and as a personality psychologist and as a clinical theorist, most of what I've talked to you guys about is your psyche and its structure as if it was like a soul that inhabited you. And there's some real utility in that. You know, you're an individual demarcated from the community. You can be set up in a healthy manner or a non-healthy manner. The problem with that is that you're not just an individual. You're connected to all these external dynamic networks that are really, really important. And it isn't even easy to separate them from you. You know, like you might say, well, this is especially true once you become a parent, is like, is your child more you than your arm? You know, well, you think it's pretty obvious that parts of you that are physically linked are more key to you as an entity, but it's by no means obvious. I think many people would much more happily sacrifice an arm than a child, and so your boundaries are not, where your boundaries are located are not precisely isomorphic with the outline of your body. It's not that simple at all. And so you're embedded in all sorts of networks that can pull you down rapidly or elevate you, because the other thing that happens is that, well, let's say I've never traded with anyone, and I go up to someone and I say, well, do you want to trade? And they say, well, why, how can I trust you? And the answer to that is, well, you have to take my word for it. Well, that's not a very good argument. You might say instead, well, here's what I have to offer, and you can evaluate it. But the person's likely to say, well, I don't know how to evaluate it, and so I'm still stuck with taking your word. So that's a bad problem. And you'll see that if you ever try to sell a product in the marketplace, is if you don't, if the product is new and it's complex, then you're forcing the person that wants to buy it to evaluate it, and then you're forcing them to take the risk of being wrong as well as the time it would take to evaluate it, and they don't like that. What they want is what's often called social proof, which is, okay, well, you want to trade with me, who else have you traded with? And if the answer is 0, then they are going to say, well, you're an interesting person and all that, but I've got these other people over here who've already traded with a bunch of people, and therefore the risk is lower, in part because, let's say, I have a supervisor, and I'm going to make a decision. And my primary concern is that my supervisor will not hate me for making the decision. It's not that my primary concern is to make the best decision. It's not the same thing. It's that I want to make a decision that I'm not going to get in trouble for. Okay, so how do I do that? Because I need a post hoc justification. So I buy something from you and it turns out to be terrible. And I get called on the table for it. And what do I say? I say, well, that person was buying from it, and that person was buying from him, and that person was buying from him. Like, all these other people were doing the same thing, so it's not like the error is localized in me, and that's often a very credible story. But if the answer is, well, I evaluated it and decided to take a risk, it's like, well, out the door with you, Sonny, because, that's an indication that you're not capable of doing that sort of thing. So I think part of the reason that people spiral downhill into 0 is because positive feedback, like a positive feedback loop, is a loop that increases the probability that the loop will continue, right? A positive feedback loop is, you've experienced this when you hear microphone feedback in an amplified system. So, the microphone sends a message to the speakers, and then the speakers send out the message amplified, and then the microphone picks up the message and it gets amplified again, and you get this howling occur, which can be deafening, but can also destroy the system, because it'll keep amplifying upward until the speakers blow, for example. That's a positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop can spiral you upward, or it can spiral you downward. And so a virtuous circle, a virtuous positive feedback loop, is when, well, I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and I've traded with him, and now I can say to you, I've traded with these 3 people, and you go talk to them and they say good things, and so then you say, well, I'll trade with you, and then because of that, then you're even more likely to trade with me, and it's like the thing starts to spiral uphill, and it does that, I think, in a nonlinear form. And so, because one of the things you guys are going to be asking yourself as you mature, because what's happening is that income inequality is increasing, right? And you might ask, well, why is that? The first thing you need to know is that that's what income does. So it's not like you need an explanation for it. This is the explanation. It's like a natural rule. If you run a trading game to its logical conclusion, one person ends up with all the money and everyone else ends up with 0. If you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a subpersonality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One of the things about Skinner's rats, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so But, a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So, anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. And we could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema, even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion. And it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. So you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like, that's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And, one of the things we're going to try to sort out is, how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else? Because that's not obvious. And you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it. It has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol-dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality, and one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality, and so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where, the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful, than I would say, than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything. And the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you used to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame, goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do. So we should stop, because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So emotions, forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much. But if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary. Right? You don't want to go into a biker bar because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic. You don't want the terror. You don't want the frenzied fight. You don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay. So, basic motivations. Hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger/aggression. Thermoregulation. Panic and escape. Affiliation and care. Sexual desire. Exploration. Play. And you can kind of break those in. You can kind of break those into the classic Darwinian categories too and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance. That'd be your survival. Ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an ingestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations, pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic, and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction, affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally. When I went to Harvard, I came from McGill, and I had spent a lot of time with my advisor there and a research team that he had trying to understand the genesis of antisocial behavior, and among adolescents mostly. So, well, as kids as well. Antisocial behavior is very persistent. So if you have a child who's conduct disordered at the age of 4, the probability that they will be criminal at the age of 15 or 20 is extremely high. It's unbelievably stable. It's a very dismal literature because you see these early onset aggressive kids and it's persistent. And then you look at the intervention literature and you throw up your hands because no interventions work. And believe me, psychologists have tried everything you can possibly imagine and a bunch of things that you can't in order to ameliorate that. So we were really interested in trying to understand, for example, if you're antisocial by the age of 4, then there isn't an intervention that seems to be effective. So, and the standard penological theory is really quite horrifying in this regard because what you see is that male aggression peaks around the age of 15 and then it declines fairly precipitously and sort of normalizes again by the age of 27. And standard penological theory essentially is this cold-hearted. It's like if you have someone who's a multiple offender, you just throw them in prison till they're 27. Then they age out of it. And that's all there is to it. That's what we've got. Now, there's some downside to that because there's a corollary literature that suggests that the worst thing that you can do with antisocial people is to group them together, which is what we do in prisons. So that's a whole mess. Anyways, one of the things we were doing was trying to see if there might be cognitive predictors of antisocial behavior. And so we used this battery of neuropsychological tests that was put together at the Montreal Neurological Institute. It took about 11 hours to administer and hypothetically assessed prefrontal cortical function. And we computerized that and reduced it to about 90 minutes and then assessed antisocial adolescents in Montreal and found out that they did show deficits in problem-solving ability that we associated with prefrontal ability. When I got to Harvard, I thought, well, that's interesting. We could use the neuropsych battery to predict negative behavior. Perhaps we could use it to predict positive behavior. So I thought, well, what if we turned the neuropsych battery over and thought, well, can we predict grades, for example? Because, that's a decent thing to predict. So we ran a study that looked at Harvard kids, University of Toronto kids, line workers at a Milwaukee factory, and managers and executives at the same factory. And what we found was that the average score across these neuropsychological tests. They were kind of like games. They were game-like, So in one test, there were 5 lights in the middle of the screen, and a box was associated with each light, and you had to learn by trial and error which box was associated with each light. That was one of the tests. So we took people's average score across the tests because they seemed to clump together into a single structure. You can find that out statistically. If you take a bunch of tests, you can find out how they clump together statistically by looking at their patterns of correlations. And you might get multiple clumps, which is what happens with personality research, where you get 5, or you might get a singular clump, which is what happens in cognitive research. And we got a single clump, essentially. And then we were trying to figure out if, at the same time, I was reading the literature on performance prediction. And there's an extensive literature on performance prediction, a lot of it generated by the armed forces, by the way, indicating that IQ is a very good predictor of long-term life success. And so here's the general rule. If your job is simple, which means you do the same thing every day, then IQ predicts how fast you'll learn the job, but not how well you do it. But if your job is complex, which means that the demands change on an ongoing basis, then the best predictor of success is general cognitive ability. And I learned that the general cognitive ability tests clump together into a single factor. That's fluid intelligence, or IQ. And then we didn't know if the factor that we had found was the same factor as IQ. And we still haven't really figured out whether or not that was the case, because it kind of depends on how you do the analysis. But anyways, I got deeply into the performance prediction literature, and I found out, well, if you wanted to predict people's performance in life, there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to know their general cognitive ability if they're going to do a complex job. You need to know their trait conscientiousness. Some of you might have heard that rebranded as grit in a very corrupt act, by the way, because it's a good predictor of long-term life success. Freedom from negative emotion, low neuroticism, is another predictor, but it's sort of third on the hierarchy. And then openness to experience, which is a personality trait, is associated with expertise in creative domains. The evidence that, now I should tell you, since it's such a complicated question, I should tell you how to make an IQ test, because it's actually really easy, and you need to know this to actually understand what IQ is. So imagine that you generated a set of 10,000 questions, okay, about anything. They could be math problems, they could be general knowledge, they could be vocabulary, they could be multiple choice. It really doesn't matter what they're about, as long as they require abstraction to solve. So they'd be formulated linguistically, but mathematically would also apply. And then you have those 10,000 questions. Now you take a random set of 100 of those questions, and you give them to 1,000 people, and all you do is sum up the answers, right? So some people are going to get most of them right, and some of them are going to get most of them wrong. You just rank order the people in terms of their score. Correct that for age, and you have IQ. That's all there is to it. And what you'll find is that no matter which random set of 100 questions you take, the people at the top of one random set will be at the top of all the others, and with very, very, very high consistency. So one thing you need to know is that if any social science claims whatsoever are correct, then the IQ claims are correct, because the IQ claims are more psychometrically rigorous than any other phenomenon that's been discovered by social scientists. Now, the IQ literature is a dismal literature. No one likes it. Here's why. Here's an example. So here's a fun little fact for you, for liberals and conservatives alike, because conservatives think there's a job for everyone if people just get off their asses and get to work. And liberals think, well, you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, there isn't a job for everyone. And no, you can't train everyone to do everything. That's wrong. And here's one of the consequences of that. So as I mentioned, the armed forces has done a lot of work on IQ, and they started back in 1919. And the reason they did that was because, well, for obvious reasons, let's say there's a war, and you want to get qualified people into the officer positions as rapidly as possible, or you'll lose. So that's a reason. Now, the armed forces has experimented with IQ tests since 1919. And in the last 20 years, a law was passed as a consequence of that analysis, which was that it was illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces who had an IQ of less than 83. Now, the question is why? And the answer was, All of that effort put in by the armed forces indicated that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything that you could be trained to do in the military that wasn't positively counterproductive. Now you got to think about that, because the military is chronically desperate for people, right? Then it's not like people are lining up to be inducted, right? They have to go out and recruit, and it's not easy. And so they're desperate to get their hands on every body they can possibly manage. And then, especially in wartime, but also in peacetime. But then there was another reason too, which was the armed forces was also set up from a policy perspective to take people in the underclass, let's say, and train them and move them up at least into the working class or maybe the middle class. So there's a policy element to it too. And so even from that perspective, you could see that the military is desperate to bring people in. But with an IQ of 83 or less, it's not happening. Okay, so how many people have an IQ of 83 or less? 10%. Now, if that doesn't hurt you to hear, then you didn't hear it properly. Because what it implies is that in a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. All right, well, what are we going to do? We're going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that? And believe me, we have every reason to. Or we're going to contend with the fact that we need to figure out how it might be possible to find a place for people on the lower end of the general cognitive distribution to take their productive and worthwhile place in society. And that isn't just going to be a matter of dumping money down the hierarchy, because giving people who have nothing to do money isn't helpful. It doesn't work. It's not that simple. Well, so that's kind of an answer to the question of whether or not we should deal with IQ forthrightly. It's like, if you can find a flaw in that logic, like, just go right ahead. It's not like I was thrilled to death to discover all of this. By no stretch of the imagination was that the case. So what? So IQ is reliable and valid. That's the first thing. It's more reliable and valid than any other psychometric test ever designed by social scientists by a factor of about 3. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is it predicts long-term life outcome at about 0.3, 0.4, which leaves about 85%, 70 to 85% of the story unexplained, but it's still the best thing that we have. Well, it's also the case that in places like Great Britain, when IQ tests were first introduced, they were actually used by the socialists, and they were used to identify poor people who had potential, cognitive potential, and to move them into institutes of higher education. So there's an upside, a social upside as well. This is something you can't say anything about without immediately being killed. So I'm hesitant to broach the topic. But I'll tell you one thing that I did in the last week that's relevant to this. And this just shows you how complex the problem is. First of all, we should point out that race is a very difficult thing to define because racial boundaries aren't tight, right? So when you talk about racial differences in IQ, you're faced with the thorny problem of defining race. And that's a big problem from a scientific perspective. But we'll leave that aside. And I wrote an article this week. Somebody stood up at one point in one of my talks, and Vice, bless their hearts, took this particular question and used it as an indication of the quality of the people who are my so-called followers. And by the way, the quality of my so-called followers is pretty damn high. And you can find that out quite rapidly just by looking at the YouTube comments, which are head and shoulders above the standard set of YouTube comments, I can tell you that. So someone asked me about the Jewish question, right? And the implication, it was actually someone Jewish, and the implication was that Jews are overrepresented in positions of authority and power. And I had just spoken for like an hour and a half, and this guy had an axe to grind, and I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm getting into this at the moment. And so I said I can't answer that question. But that's not a very good answer. So I wrote a blog post this week, and I said, look, here's the situation. All right. Jews are overrepresented in positions of power and authority. But then let's open our eyes a little bit, and think for like 2 or 3 seconds and think, hey, guess what? They're also overrepresented in positions of competence. And it's not like we have more geniuses than we know what to do with. And if the Jews happen to be producing more of them, which they are, by the way, then that's a pretty good thing for the rest of us. So let's not confuse competence with power and authority, even though that's a favorite trick of the radical leftists, who always fail to make that distinction. Well, why does this overrepresentation occur? Because it does. There's also overrepresentation in political movements, including radical political movements. Okay, why? Well, answer one, Jewish conspiracy. Okay, that's not a very good answer. We've used that answer before. All right, but do we have an alternative? Well, here's an alternative. The average Ashkenazi IQ is somewhere between 110 and 115, which is about 1 standard deviation above the population average. And so what that means is that the average Ashkenazi/European Jew has an IQ that's higher than 85% of the population. That's a lot higher. Now, that doesn't make that much difference in the middle of the distribution, okay? But geniuses don't exist at the middle of the distribution. They exist at the tails of the distribution. And you don't need much of a move at the mean to produce walloping differences at the tails. And the tails are important because a lot of where we draw exceptional people from the exceptions, right? So here's another example of the same thing. Most engineers are male. Why? Because men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And you might say, well, that's sociocultural. It's like, no, it's not. And we know that because if you stack up countries by their egalitarian social policies, which you can do quite effectively, and then you look at the overrepresentation of men in STEM fields, the overrepresentation increases as the countries become more egalitarian. So it's not sociocultural. Okay, now men aren't that much more interested in things than women. It's 1 standard deviation, which is about the same difference, by the way, between the population norm and the Ashkenazi Jews. But if you're looking at the 1 person in 20 or the 1 person in 50 who's hyper interested in things and thus likely to become an engineer, then most of them are men. Here's another example of the same thing. Men are more aggressive than women. Now, you might ask, how much? And the answer to that is, best place to look at that is in Sweden, where the egalitarian policies have been laid out for a long period of time, and you can get a more direct inference about biology. If you took a random man and a random woman out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So that's not that much, right? It deviates from 50-50, but it's not like 90-10, it's 60-40. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, we got a tail problem here again. Let's say that now you decide to go out onto the extremes of aggression and you identify the most aggressive 1 in 100 persons. They're all men. Guess who's in prison? Those people. That's why most of the people in prison are men. And so this is elementary. Part of the problem in our society is that we don't understand statistics. We don't understand that you can have relatively small differences at the population level that produce walloping consequences at the tails of the distribution. Okay, so back to IQ. One final thing to say about IQ. The ethnic differences are difficult to dispense with. It's not easy to make them go away. You can say, well, the tests aren't culture fair. Well, here's a test of that. So imagine you test group A with an IQ test and you test group B with an IQ test. And then you look at their actual performance in whatever you're predicting. If the test was biased against ethnic group A, then it would underpredict their performance. And that doesn't happen. Now you could say, well, there's systemic bias in the performance measures and the potential measures. And that's a possibility. All right. Now, one other thing about that. There's a real danger in the ethnicity IQ debate, and the danger is that we confuse intelligence with value, or that we confuse intelligence with human value. That's a better way of thinking about it. And one of the things that we're going to have to understand here is that that's a mistake, is that being more intelligent doesn't make you a better person. That's not the case. It makes you more useful for complex cognitive operations. But you can be pretty damn horrific as a genius son of a bitch, right? It's morally neutral. And we also know that from the psychometric data, by the way. There doesn't seem to be any relationship whatsoever between intelligence and virtue. And so if it does turn out that nature and the fates do not align with our egalitarian presuppositions, which is highly probable, we shouldn't therefore make the mistake of assuming that if group A or person A is lower on one of these attributes than group B or person B, that is somehow reflective of their intrinsic value as human beings. That's a big mistake.